Did you do it? Yes. What did it cost? Everything. Most people know that dialogue from the end of the Avengers Infinity Wars, where Thanos completes his mission, but at a great cost. In the real world, we would call this a Pyrrhic victory, where the victorious party suffers such a great loss that it puts into question whether or not it was truly worth it. Often, these victories have long term ramifications that negate the short term victory, as the loss was so great, it voids any true sense of benefit or achievement. Throughout the history of warfare and conflict, there are several examples of Pyrrhic victories, and today we will be discussing five of them. The Gothic War. Although the Western Roman Empire fell into barbarian hands in 476 AD, the eastern part of the empire, with its capital Constantinople, remained prosperous and controlled by Romans. Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian wanted to bring back the glory of Rome and restore imperial authority in the West, so he invaded Ostrogoth held Italy and Vandal held North Africa in 535 AD. The fighting was intensive and brutal, especially on the Italian peninsula, leading to several devastating sieges. In the middle of the war, the Eastern Roman Empire was struck with what was called Justinian's plague, which was a form of the bubonic plague. The plague, at its peak, wiped out a quarter of the population of Constantinople and had immense political and economic ramifications as it limited tax revenue and manpower, which prolonged the war even longer. By 554, the Ostrogoths and Vandals were defeated in Italy and North Africa, with the Romans regaining vast swaths of territory. This, however, doesn't last long. After a few decades, the Lombards invade and able to conquer large parts of Italy as it was left decimated, depopulated, and open for the taking. A century later, the Romans lost control of most of Greece, Dalmatia, Thrace, and Macedonia. The Gothic Wars drained the resources of the Eastern Roman Empire immensely, and they thus began to decline until Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople in 1453 AD and finally closed the chapter of the Roman Empire in the history books. Bunker Hill. Shortly after the battles of Lexington and Concord, which is seen as the start of the American Revolutionary War, American troops learned that the British were planning to send troops from Boston to occupy the hills surrounding the city. The American rebels built a large dirt wall and fortified their position in an attempt to stop the British from occupying the hills, which would give them complete strategic control of the area around Boston Harbor. Furious with this, the British commander sent 2,200 troops to smash the ragtag group of 1,000 militiamen manning the fortifications. The British soldiers marched straight up the hill, right into the Americans' line of fire. The Americans' accurate musket fire drove back two separate British attacks, but by the third advance, the rebels had used their stores of ammunition. Following a few frantic minutes of hand to hand combat, the militiamen abandoned the hill and retreated. The British victory at Bunker Hill came at a punishing cost, sustaining 1,000 casualties, many of whom were disproportionately officers. Their heavy losses also forced them to scrap plans to seize another piece of high ground on the outskirts of Boston. After the battle, British General William Clinton said a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. The Americans, meanwhile, only suffered about 450 casualties, and they declared the defeat as a moral victory, and many more people joined and supported the Patriot cause. The small, inexperienced American force had gone head to head with a larger and better equipped army, arguably the best fighting force the world had ever seen, and had shown they would not be beaten without a fight. The British ultimately lose the war to the Americans and the French, who would later join. Borodino. With the seemingly unstoppable Emperor Napoleon dominating much of continental Europe, the only threat that seemed to evade him was the mighty British Empire and its Royal Navy, who led a blockade of the French coast. To combat this and cripple Britain financially, Napoleon set up a continental blockade of the British Empire, which forbade most of Europe from trading with Britain. Russia and Tsar Alexander I, for several reasons, decided to withdraw from the blockade, which then made Napoleon decide to invade the Russian Empire with around 600,000 soldiers from around his empire in 1812 to force them to comply. Napoleon thought that a decisive victory against the Russians would force them to surrender and comply to his demands, but even after a string of victories as he marched through western Russia, he failed to achieve a decisive victory as the Russian army kept retreating, forcing Napoleon deeper into hostile territory and further from home and stable supply lines. Napoleon thought that if he were able to take the capital city of the Russian Empire, Moscow, it would be the decisive victory he needed to force the Russians into negotiating. All this came ahead near the town of Borodino, which was the Russian army's last chance to prevent Napoleon from taking Moscow, which was only 70 miles away. Fighting was fierce between both sides as the French rained artillery shells on the entrenched Russian soldiers. The French soldiers slowly advanced, but the Russians were able to hold their ground. After a strong push led by the French cavalry, the Russians are slowly pushed back and are in a dire state. Napoleon, however, fails to commit his elite reserve troops to the fight, which cost the French army dearly as the Russians are able to retreat and again are not decisively defeated. Napoleon suffered heavy casualties, losing about 30,000 of his 135,000 soldiers that he had at the beginning of the battle. After the battle, Napoleon is able to march to Moscow, where he finds the city deserted and burned. Tsar Alexander, however, does not surrender despite losing his capital. With Napoleon and his soldiers far away from home and with little supplies, the French abandoned the city after 5 weeks and marched back home where thousands of soldiers died from hunger, exhaustion, and the cold. Napoleon's grand army was crippled and never the same after the battle, leading to French power on the continent being diminished and ultimately sealed the fate and demise of Napoleon. Pearl Harbor. With the world at war in 1941, American President Roosevelt stopped shipments of American steel and oil to Japan to curb continued Japanese aggression in the Pacific. This was a crippling blow to Japan's military as they relied on imported natural resources to fuel its war machine. After military failures against the Soviets and with its army being bogged down in China, Japan saw another solution to its resource deficiency problem. If it could quickly conquer the Dutch and British colonies in Southeast Asia and gain complete control of the oil, rubber, and other raw materials it needed, then it could defend its interests in the Pacific against the Europeans who were now busy fighting a major war in Europe against the Germans and the Italians. The only force that could stop the Japanese was the American Pacific Fleet, which was conveniently gathered at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Japan knew that the United States was dominant economically and militarily, but it wasn't afraid of an American attack on its home islands. Japan, however, was worried that the continued support of China by the Americans would continue to drain their already depleted resources. Knowing that many Americans did not want to go to war, Japan thought that if it suddenly destroyed the U.S. fleet, the U.S. would simply give up and allow Japan to consolidate its grasp on East Asia. On December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, killing or wounding nearly 3,500 Americans, sinking or significantly damaging 21 ships, destroying 188 aircraft, and damaging another 159. This, however, backfires as the outcome isn't what the Japanese expected, and the United States declares war on December 8th, vowing revenge. Despite seizing victory for the day and territorial gains in the months that followed, Japan would ultimately have two nuclear bombs dropped on it and lose the war to the Americans. Pyrrhic War. Finally, we will talk about the war that gave us the term Pyrrhic Victory. In 290 BC, after the Samnite Wars, Rome established its dominance over central Italy, and as its influence continued to expand, it came into contact with the Greek speaking city states on the southern part of the peninsula. Tarentum was the largest city state in the area, and when they attacked the Roman naval fleet, the Romans declared war. The city of Tarentum then decides to ask King Pyrrhus of Epirus for help in defeating the Romans. Pyrrhus agreed, and the two forces would face off at the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC. Hearing that Pyrrhus landed in Italy, the Romans sent 4 legions to Tarentum to antagonize Pyrrhus into battle before the rest of the Greek allies joined him and raided several Greek city-states in southern Italy. Once Pyrrhus found out that the Romans were planning on attacking the city of Heraclea, he rushed to face the Romans in battle. The Romans had 45,000 men compared to the 35,000 Greeks. The two armies camped on opposite sides of the Sirius River. The entire Roman army then crosses the river, forcing Pyrrhus to scramble and quickly set up his phalanx and push the Romans back, sandwiching them between the river and the long pikes of the phalanx. After intense back and forth fighting, Pyrrhus rallies his troops to victory. 7,000 Romans die in the battle compared to only 4,000 Greeks. But what makes his victory so costly is that Pyrrhus loses many of his senior officers and elite veteran soldiers, which would have been extremely difficult to replace on foreign soil. The two faced off again in the Battle of Ascultum in 279 BC, with both sides having 40,000 men. Fierce fighting ensued, but the long pikes of the phalanx held strong against the short swords of the Roman legions. With the help of his cavalry and war elephants, the Greeks attacked the Roman flanks, inflicting heavy casualties, causing the Romans to retreat. 6,000 Romans died in the battle, compared to only 3,500 Greeks. Despite the Greeks losing a little more than half the men the Romans did, the losses began to add up as Pyrrhus could not get more reinforcements from his allies, whereas it seems the Romans had an endless amount of men and determination to keep fighting. Pyrrhus famously says, "One more such victory, and we are undone." With complete victory against the Romans unlikely, Pyrrhus leaves to help Greeks in Sicily and therefore cedes southern Italy to the Romans. Thank you.